The salt air tasted like copper on her tongue. Or maybe that was blood from where she'd bitten the inside of her cheek for the third time in an hour, hunched over a mahogany desk that had belonged to her grandmother, while the numbers on the spreadsheet before her rearranged themselves into the exact shape of ruin. Rowan Hayes pressed her fingertips into her temples and stared at the column marked a B-share distribution hostile reallocation scenario until the figures blurred. And for a moment she couldn't tell if the roaring in her ears was the ocean hammering the cliffs below the villa, or her own pulse reminding her that she hadn't slept more than 3 hours in the last 48. The Crescent Bay house had always been her sanctuary, a sprawling coastal estate perched on the granite bluffs of Carver Shore, all whitewashed stone and broad windows that drank the Pacific light. But today, the beauty felt irrelevant, almost offensive, because while the sea sparkled and the gulls wheeled in lazy arcs against a sky so blue it looked painted, her entire empire was being carved apart by a man who had once promised to love her until the world ended, and who had apparently decided to end it himself. She pushed back from the desk, the leather chair groaning against the wide plank flooring, and pressed both palms flat against the cool wood surface, as though she could anchor herself to something solid. The phone beside her elbow had 17 unread messages, all from her general counsel, Lauren, each one more urgent than the last. The gist was the same across all 17. Victor Crane was accelerating his timeline. The dummy corporation, something called Pinnacle Ventures, had acquired enough proxy votes to force an emergency board session within 2 weeks. If Rowan couldn't prove that Victor's seat on the board was secured through fraudulent credentials, she would be voted out of the company she had built from a single patent and a maxed-out credit card at 24 years old. Hayes Meridian Technologies, the biostructural engineering firm she had steered through 3 market crashes and 2 industry revolutions, would belong to a man whose greatest talent was smiling while he lied. She closed the laptop. She needed air. The closet in the master suite still held the summer things she'd left behind the last time she visited, back when her marriage was merely failing instead of actively weaponized. She pulled out a teal bikini, something she bought on impulse during a conference in Port Henley, and changed quickly, catching a glimpse of herself in the full-length mirror beside the bathroom door. She looked thinner than she remembered, the architecture of her collarbones more prominent, the hollows beneath her cheekbones sharper. The bikini was striking against her fair skin, the color somewhere between ocean and tourmaline, and it followed the lines of her body with a precision that would have pleased her once. Now she barely registered it. Beauty felt like currency she no longer wanted to spend. She gathered the most critical stack of documents from the desk, the ones she needed to review once more before Lauren's call at 4, and slid them into a waterproof portfolio sleeve. The ABS share. Appendix, a 30-page financial breakdown that mapped every backdoor transaction Pinnacle Ventures had used to accumulate proxy votes. She held separately, intending to study it in the sun. She needed the glare and the wind and the crash of waves to remind her that the world was larger than a boardroom. Because if she spent one more minute in that study, she was going to scream. The boardwalk that led from the villa's rear terrace down to the private cove had been damaged in a late spring storm. Several planks ripped free, and the railing twisted where a falling branch had struck it. And she'd hired a local craftsman to repair it, after her property manager recommended him. She'd exchanged exactly 2 emails with the man, both brief and professional, and had given him the access code to the lower gate so he could come and go without disturbing her. She had not expected him to be working today, but as she stepped out onto the terrace, squinting against the midday brilliance, she could hear the rhythmic bite of a hand plane somewhere below, a sound so steady and deliberate it almost resembled breathing. She descended the intact portion of the boardwalk, carefully bare feet warm on the sun-bleached wood, the portfolio sleeve tucked under her arm and the appendix clutched in her right hand. The cove opened up before her, a crescent of pale sand framed by dark volcanic rock, the surf rolling in with the kind of lazy power that could knock you off your feet if you weren't paying attention. To her left, where the boardwalk met a small observation platform, the craftsman was working. Darius Cole was not what she had pictured. Her property manager had called him a carpenter, and she had imagined someone older, paunchy, with sawdust in his beard and a belt full of clinking tools. The man crouched on the platform, fitting a new plank into the framework he'd built, was tall and broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke less of gym vanity and more of years of physical labor. the kind of build that came from carrying timber and bending steel by hand. He wore heavy canvas work pants the color of wet sand, a faded gray Henley with the sleeves pushed past his elbows, and a pair of safety goggles perched on his forehead, holding back close-cropped dark hair streaked with early silver at the temples. His forearms were cabled with muscle and mapped with fine scars, the signatures of a lifetime spent working with sharp things. He was maybe mid-30s, his jaw squared and darkened with 2 days of stubble, his face deep brown and creased at the corners of his eyes from squinting into sun and sawdust. He looked like someone who had been through something and come out the other side quieter than he went in. He glanced up as she approached, gave her a brief professional nod, and returned to his work. There was no lingering scan of her body, no flicker of appraisal, no carefully masked double-take. Just the nod, and then the plane moving again, peeling a thin ribbon of cedar that curled like calligraphy and dropped into the pile at his knees. Rowan stepped past him onto the sand. She spread a towel near the water's edge, sat down cross-legged, and opened the appendix to page 12, where Pinnacle Ventures' shell company structure was diagrammed in her counsel's meticulous hand. The wind was stronger than she'd anticipated, coming in from the northwest in irregular gusts that pressed her hair flat against her cheek and tugged at the corners of the pages. She held them firmly, scanning the numbers, trying to see the pattern. Lauren swore was there, the single transaction that would link Pinnacle directly to Victor's personal accounts and prove he was orchestrating the coup himself rather than through an independent third party. She found it on page 17. A wire transfer routed through a holding company in the Calder Islands dated 3 days after their separation was filed, the exact amount corresponding to a deposit Victor had made into what he told her was a charitable trust. Her breath caught. She reached for her phone to photograph the page, and in that half-second of distraction she loosened her grip. The gust hit like a slap. The appendix ripped free from her fingers, all 30 pages fanning open like a wounded bird, and the wind snatched the critical sheet page 17 and sent it tumbling end over end toward the surf. Rowan lunged to her feet, sand spraying beneath her heels, but the paper was already 20 feet away and accelerating, caught in the onshore draft that was funneling between the cove's rock walls like a natural wind tunnel. She could see the wave gathering a thick green wall of water rising to its crest, and she knew with sickening certainty that the page would be pulp in 3 seconds. A blur of gray and tan moved at the edge of her vision. Darius had dropped the handplane and was already in motion, not running after the paper, but running at an angle, cutting across the beach on a trajectory that seemed wrong until it was suddenly perfectly right. He moved with an explosive, athletic precision that was startling for a man his size, his bare feet digging into the sand, his body low and balanced like a sprinter coming out of the blocks. The wind shifted, eddied, caught the page, and spun it sideways exactly where he was. His hand shot out fingers, closing around the sheet with a delicacy that belied the force of his sprint, and he pulled it against his chest just as the wave broke behind him, sending a ton of white foam across the sand that stopped 6 inches from his heels. He straightened, checked the page, walked toward her. Rowan stood frozen. The rest of the appendix clutched against her sternum, her heart hammering. He closed the distance between them and stopped at a respectful remove, a full arm's length beyond what would have been comfortable for most people, and extended the page toward her. His eyes, she noticed now, were a deep, warm amber, the color of aged bourbon held to the light, and they held hers with a steady, untroubled calm. They did not drop to the teal fabric stretched across her chest. They did not flicker to the bare stretch of her waist or the curve of her hips. He looked at her the way you look at a colleague during a meeting with full, undistracted attention to the matter at hand. "The cove funnels wind from the northwest through those basalt columns," he said, his voice low and unhurried with a faint rasp that suggested he didn't use it often. "Creates a Venturi effect, accelerates and redirects at about 30 degrees east of what you'd expect. If you're going to work with loose paper down here, weight the corners. Flat stones work, or I've got clamps on the platform." He was explaining fluid dynamics. He had just performed what amounted to an acrobatic rescue of the most important financial document in her life, and he was calmly explaining the physics of wind, as though this were a minor footnote to his day. "Thank you," she said, and was annoyed to hear her voice come out slightly breathless. He nodded again, the same brief professional dip of the chin, and turned back toward the platform. Rowan watched him go, the page warm in her fingers where his hand had creased it, and felt something shift in the locked, exhausted architecture of her chest, some bolt sliding free that she hadn't known was rusted shut. It wasn't attraction, not exactly, or not yet. It was the sudden disorienting recognition of encountering someone who did not want anything from her. She sat back down on the towel and weighted the pages with stones the way he'd suggested and tried to return to the numbers, but her focus kept drifting toward the steady sound of his playing on the wood, a rhythm that was becoming against all reason the most calming thing she'd heard in months. By 4 o'clock, she'd finished her call with Lauren, photographed every page of the appendix, and brewed a pot of pour-over coffee in the villa's kitchen, using the hand-ground beans from Thornberry and March that she brought from the city, because even in crisis, she refused to drink bad coffee. The afternoon had softened the wind, dying to a murmur, and the light through the kitchen windows was the color of warm honey. She poured 2 cups because it seemed rude not to, and carried them down to the platform where Darius was packing up his tools. He'd made significant progress. The new planks gleamed pale against the weathered gray of the originals, and the railing he'd rebuilt was a quietly beautiful piece of joinery, each joint fitted so precisely she couldn't see the seams. She handed him the cup, and he accepted it with a nod and a murmur of thanks that was barely a word, more a vibration in his throat. "This is exceptional work," she said, running her free hand along the railing. "The joinery is, I don't even know the term. It looks like it grew this way." "Mortise and tenon," he said, blowing steam from the cup. "No hardware. Stronger than bolts if you do it right. Wood wants to hold together. You just have to find the grain." She leaned against the railing facing the sea and let the silence sit between them. It was comfortable, which surprised her. Silence with Victor had always been a weapon, a prelude to the next cutting remark. Silence with Darius felt like an open room. His laptop was sitting on a makeshift workbench he'd set up from 2 sawhorses and a sheet of marine plywood, and it was open. The screen angled away from the sun. She hadn't meant to look. She was turning to set her coffee cup down, and the screen caught her peripheral vision, and what she saw there made her body go very still. It wasn't a set of woodworking plans, it wasn't a measurement spreadsheet or a lumber invoice. The screen was running a massively complex building information modeling suite, a custom interface she didn't recognize with a level of sophistication that went far beyond anything commercially available. The display was a 3-dimensional wireframe rendering of an architectural structure she knew intimately because she had sat in a boardroom 18 months ago and watched her then-husband present it as his own masterwork. The Apex Biodome. The biodome was the project that had changed everything. It was a revolutionary biostructural habitat design, a self-sustaining enclosed ecosystem that used parametric load-bearing algorithms to distribute stress across a lattice framework inspired by diatom shells. The design had won the Aldrich Prize for Computational Architecture and had been featured on the cover of 3 major industry journals. Victor had leveraged his supposed authorship of the project to position himself as a visionary, and that reputation had been the primary credential he'd used to secure a seat on the Hayes Meridian Board of Directors. It was, in a very real sense, the foundation of his power, and it was on this carpenter's laptop, not as a finished rendering, but at the foundational level. The raw structural CAD geometry, the parametric equations, the physics engine, the bones beneath the skin. Rowan set her coffee down very carefully. "Darius." He looked up from his cup. "What is that?" She pointed at the screen. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. A door closing, a wall going up. He set his own cup down, reached over and closed the laptop. "Old project," he said. "That's the Apex Biodome. I know what it is. You know what it is because you've seen it or because you built it." The silence that followed was different from the comfortable ones before. It had weight. It had teeth. The surf hissed against the sand below them, and a gull screamed somewhere out over the water, and Darius Cole stood very still with his hands at his sides and looked at Rowan Hayes with an expression she could not read, something between resignation and relief, as though he had been carrying a stone for a very long time and someone had finally asked him to put it down. "Both," he said. She sat on the edge of the workbench. He remained standing, leaning against the railing he'd built, arms crossed, and he told her. 5 years ago, Darius Cole had been the founder and chief architect of a small computational design firm called Lattice Structural, operating out of a converted warehouse in Ashford. He'd been 31, married to a woman named Simone, father to a 1-year-old daughter named Lily, and on the verge of a breakthrough. The Biodome project was his obsession, a design he'd been developing since graduate school. A structure that could maintain a fully enclosed, self-sustaining biome using nothing but the geometry of its own framework to manage temperature, humidity, and structural load. The parametric algorithms at its core were entirely his invention. Years of work encoded in hundreds of thousands of lines of custom code. Then Simone got sick. The diagnosis came fast and brutal. Alder-Whitmore syndrome, a rare degenerative condition that attacked the myelin sheathing of the central nervous system, turning a vibrant, laughing woman into a stranger who couldn't remember her daughter's name. The standard treatment slowed it, but couldn't stop it. There was one experimental protocol available through a private research clinic in the Blue Ridge Valley that showed real promise, but it cost more money than Darius had ever seen in his life. $900,000 for the full course, not covered by insurance, not negotiable, not optional if Simone was going to have any chance at all. Victor Crane's firm, Crane Stanton Partners, had been circling Lattice Structural for months. Victor had recognized the Biodome's potential long before the industry press caught on, and he wanted it. Not the company, not the team, just the intellectual property. When Simone's diagnosis became known, Victor saw his opening and moved with the cold precision of a predator. He approached Darius with an offer. Crane Stanton would acquire Lattice Structural's entire IP portfolio, including the Biodome, in exchange for an immediate cash payment of $1.2 million. Darius would sign a comprehensive NDA, prohibiting him from ever claiming authorship of the work, and a full transfer of intellectual property rights that would attribute the designs to Crane Stanton's in-house team. "He came to me in the hospital parking lot," Darius said, his voice flat and careful, as though he were describing something that had happened to someone else. "Simone was inside. She'd had a seizure that morning. Lily was with my mother. And Victor stood there in a $4,000 suit and told me he could save my wife's life, but only if I gave him my life's work. He said it like he was doing me a favor." Darius signed. He took the money and enrolled Simone in the experimental program. For 6 months, she improved her memory, sharpening her motor control, returning, and Darius allowed himself to believe that the trade had been worth it, that buildings and algorithms were just things, and Simone was everything. Then the disease adapted, as Alder-Whitmore sometimes did, and the protocol that had been working simply stopped. Simone died 14 months after the acquisition on a Tuesday afternoon in March, with Lily asleep in the next room, and Darius holding her hand so tightly he left bruises on her skin that he could still see when they took her away. He left the architectural world entirely. He packed up Lily and moved to Crescent Bay, where Simone's family had a small cottage. And he built a woodworking shop in the garage and started taking local jobs, repairs, and custom furniture, and the kind of quiet, honest work that didn't require him to think about parametric algorithms or the man who had stolen them. He let Victor Crane claim the Biodome. He let the industry celebrate a fraud. He let it all go because holding on to it meant holding on to a grief so large it would have crushed him. And Lily needed a father who could stand. The NDA, Rowan said, her voice tight. Ironclad. Or so Victor believes. I had a lawyer look at it 2 years ago. There are cracks if you know where to press. Cracks like what? Like the fact that Victor's team filed for the Aldrich Prize using technical documentation that was generated before the acquisition date. Timestamps don't lie. And like the fact that I built things into that code that Victor doesn't know are there because he never had the talent to look. Rowan stared at him. The sun was lower now, painting the platform in amber. And in that light, with his arms crossed and his jaw set and his eyes holding 5 years of compressed fury and sorrow, Darius Cole looked like something carved from the same coastal rock that framed the cove, weathered and immovable and unbroken. "He's trying to take my company," she said. "You know that." "I know. He's using the Biodome reputation to legitimize his board seat. Without that, he's just a divorce attorney's nightmare with a predatory shell company. I know that too." "Then help me stop him." Darius uncrossed his arms and looked out at the ocean. The silence stretched. She could see the calculation in his expression, the weighing of risks, not for himself, but for someone else. And she understood instinctively that every decision this man made passed through a single filter. What it would mean for Lily. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. "I'm proposing that I hire you officially as a special compliance auditor attached to Hayes Meridian's internal review of the Biodome YP. The NDA prevents you from publicly claiming authorship, but it doesn't prevent you from being hired as a technical consultant to audit work product that is already in the public domain through the Aldrich Prize filing. We work within the cracks you mentioned, and we find proof that Victor committed fraud." He turned back to her. "You're a CEO. You could hire any forensic analyst on the continent." "I could, but none of them built the code. None of them know where the bodies are buried. And none of them have the motivation you have." A muscle in his jaw tightened, the first visible crack in his composure. "My motivation is my daughter. My motivation is the quiet life I built for her." "And Victor is the kind of man who doesn't stop taking," Rowan said, leaning forward. "He took your work. He took your wife's chance at dignity. Now he's taking my company, and when he's done with me, he'll find someone else. He always does. You can keep building boardwalks in Crescent Bay, and that's a good life, and I respect it. But you and I both know that as long as Victor Crane walks around wearing your genius like a borrowed suit, something in you will never be finished. Something in you will never rest." The gull screamed again far out over the water. The surf hissed. The hand plane lay on the workbench like a sleeping animal, and the new railing glowed in the amber light. Every joint perfect, every line true. "I'll need to make arrangements for Lily," he said quietly. "Whatever you need." He picked up his coffee, took a long, slow sip, and set it down. "Then I'm in." They started that night. Rowan converted the villa's sunroom into a war room, clearing the wicker furniture and replacing it with a long trestle table, 2 high-resolution monitors she had shipped overnight from the city, and a whiteboard that quickly became a constellation of names, dates, and transaction codes, connected by red lines that Rowan drew with the focused intensity of a general mapping a battlefield. Darius brought his laptop and a series of encrypted external drives that contained his original project files. The raw CAD data, the parametric code, the development logs, everything Victor thought had been erased. Working with Darius was unlike any professional collaboration Rowan had ever experienced. He was methodical to the point of obsession, but not in the anxious, performative way she'd seen in corporate environments. He moved through the code the way he moved through wood, with a patient authority that came from understanding the material at a level most people never reached. He would sit for an hour, scrolling through thousands of lines of parametric equations, his warm amber eyes tracking the logic with the same steady focus he'd used to catch a piece of paper in a crosswind. And then he would stop point at a single variable and explain in 3 sentences exactly how it proved that the code had been written on his proprietary development platform and could not have originated at Crane Stanton. Rowan, for her part, brought the strategic framework. She knew corporate law the way Darius knew structural physics intuitively and from hard experience, and she could see immediately which pieces of evidence would survive a legal challenge and which would be dismissed. They argued sometimes sharply about methodology and priorities, but the arguments were clean and direct, without ego or personal attack, and they always resolved into something stronger than either of them had proposed alone. The first few nights they worked until 2 or 3 in the morning, sustained by coffee and the particular energy that comes from shared purpose. Rowan noticed things. She noticed that Darius rolled his sleeves exactly the same way every time, 3 precise folds, as though he were preparing to build something even when he was only typing. She noticed that when he was thinking hard, he rubbed his left thumb against his ring finger where a wedding band had once been, and that the gesture was unconscious and so private that she always looked away when she saw it. She noticed that he smelled like cedar and linseed oil and the ocean, and that the scent lingered in the room after he left, and that she found herself breathing it in before she could stop herself. He noticed things too, though he was more careful about showing it. She caught him watching her once during a late-night session when she'd pulled her hair up into a messy knot and was hunched over the financial documents with her reading glasses perched on her nose. And the expression on his face was not desire, or not only desire, but something more complex, a kind of surprised recognition as though he had seen something he'd forgotten existed. When their eyes met, he looked away without embarrassment or apology, simply returning to the code, and the moment passed like a wave retreating from the sand, leaving everything slightly rearranged. On the third night, Lily came with him. Rowan opened the villa's front door expecting Darius, and found a 6-year-old girl standing beside him clutching a stuffed sea otter with one hand and his index finger with the other. She had her father's warm amber eyes and her mother's features, a face that would someday be beautiful in a delicate, serious way. And she regarded Rowan with the frank assessing gaze of a child who has learned early that adults are not always trustworthy. "This is Lily," Darius said. "My mother's feeling under the weather. I can reschedule if this is a problem." "It's not a problem," Rowan said and dropped to one knee so she was at the girl's eye level. "Hi, Lily. I'm Rowan. What's the otter's name?" "Barnaby," Lily said after a pause that suggested she was evaluating whether Rowan deserved this information. "He's a sea otter, but he doesn't like swimming because he has anxiety." "That's very understandable," Rowan said. "I have anxiety too, and I'm not even a sea otter." The ghost of a smile crossed Lily's face. She looked up at her father, who gave her a small nod and followed Rowan inside with the cautious dignity of a visiting diplomat. While Rowan and Darius worked, Lily installed herself on the sunroom couch with Barnaby and a set of colored pencils Rowan found in a desk drawer, and proceeded to draw an elaborate series of pictures that she explained in running commentary without any apparent need for response. The drawings depicted a kingdom called Mosswood, ruled by a council of bears. And the political intrigue of the Bear Council was, Rowan thought, not significantly less complex than what was happening on the whiteboard behind her. At 9 o'clock, Lily's eyelids began to droop, and Darius excused himself, lifting the girl easily onto his shoulder. She nestled against his neck, one hand still clutching Barnaby, and mumbled something inaudible into his collar. He carried her to the guest room Rowan had pointed out, and when he returned 20 minutes later, his expression was softer. The hard, professional focus gentled by whatever quiet ritual of stories or songs had preceded sleep. He sat back down at the trestle table, pulled up the next block of code, and said without looking at her, "She liked you." "She's remarkable," Rowan said. "She's everything." The word landed like a heartbeat. Rowan understood in a way that required no elaboration that this was both a statement of fact and a boundary, a quiet declaration that whatever happened between them, whatever charge was building in the late-night silences and the accidental brushes of hands reaching for the same document, Lily came first, and the world arranged itself around that truth. "I know," she said, and they went back to work. The breakthrough came on the 7th night at 11:43 p.m. with cold coffee in their cups, and the whiteboard so covered in red lines it looked like an abstract painting. Darius had been deep in the core physics algorithm of the biodome's load-bearing code, the section that governed how the lattice framework distributed stress across its diatom shell geometry. And Rowan was cross-referencing the Aldrich Prize filing dates against the Crane-Stanton acquisition timeline when she heard him make a sound she'd never heard from him before, a short, sharp exhale that might have been a laugh. "There," he said, pointing at a line of code on the screen. "Look." She rolled her chair beside his and leaned in. The line was a parametric offset value, a seemingly arbitrary number embedded in the algorithm that governed the angular distribution of the primary load-bearing struts. In context, it looked like any other variable, a technical coefficient that only someone intimately familiar with the code would think to examine. 071483, Rowan read. "What is it?" "It's Simone's birthday," Darius said. "July 14th, 1983. His voice was steady, but his hand resting on the table beside the keyboard was not quite still. I wrote this algorithm the week before she was diagnosed. She was sitting in the next room reading to Lily, and I could hear her voice through the wall, and I put this number here because I wanted her to be part of it. Part of the thing I was most proud of. He paused. It's not a random coefficient. It's a deliberate offset that affects the angular distribution by 0.003 degrees. Insignificant at normal scale, invisible in the finished renders, but structurally it's load critical. Remove it or change it, and the simulation shows catastrophic failure under high wind conditions. Victor could never have designed this from scratch because he doesn't know this number is meaningful. He'd never think to look. It's a watermark, Rowan whispered. It's a signature and it's provable. The metadata on the original file shows I created this variable 3 months before the acquisition date. Victor's team never modified it because they didn't know it mattered. It's still there in the Aldrich Prize submission, time-stamped to my development environment generated by software that was never installed on any Crane Stanton machine. Rowan stared at the number on the screen. 071483. A woman's birthday encoded into the physics of a building that would stand for 100 years. A love letter written in mathematics hidden so deep that only its author could find it buried like a seed in the foundation of something meant to endure. Darius, she said, and her voice cracked on the second syllable, and she didn't care. We've got him. The emergency board meeting was held on a Tuesday, 2 weeks later in the executive conference suite on the 42nd floor of the Hayes Meridian Tower in Harlan City. The room was all glass and brushed steel designed to intimidate, and it had the particular airless quality of a space where large amounts of money changed hands and lives changed direction. 17 board members sat around the oval table, their faces arranged in the carefully neutral expressions of people who understood that today's vote would determine the future of a multi-billion-dollar company. Lauren Price Rowan's general counsel sat at the far end with a stack of legal briefs and the controlled intensity of someone who had been preparing for this moment for a month. Victor Crane entered at 9 o'clock sharp because he had always believed punctuality was a form of dominance. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive things always fit him perfectly, and his face wore the expression Rowan knew best, the magnanimous smile of a man who believed he had already won. He was accompanied by 2 attorneys from Crestworth and Delane, the kind of legal heavy hitters whose very presence was meant to signal that resistance was futile, and he took his seat at the table with the expansive ease of someone settling into a throne. Rowan, he said, inclining his head. You look tired, Victor, she said. You look confident. Enjoy it. His smile flickered just for a moment like a candle in a draft. Then it steadied. He opened his briefcase, removed a sheath of documents, and began the formal motion to restructure the board's executive committee, a parliamentary maneuver that would, if passed, strip Rowan of her CEO designation and install a new leadership team under his direction. His voice was smooth, persuasive, practiced the voice of a man who had built an entire career on the ability to make people believe things that weren't true. He spoke about vision. He spoke about innovation. He referenced the Apex Biodome casually as the proof of his architectural genius, the credential that made him uniquely qualified to lead Hayes Meridian into its next chapter. Rowan let him talk. She watched the board members' faces as Victor spoke, reading the room with the granular precision she'd spent a decade developing, and she saw what she expected. Some were convinced, some were skeptical, most were waiting to see which way the wind blew before committing. The vote would be close. Without intervention, it might go either way. Victor concluded his remarks and called for the vote. Before we proceed, Rowan said, standing, the board is entitled to hear a compliance presentation regarding the intellectual property credentials cited in the motion. Under Section 14 of our corporate charter, any board member may request a technical audit of claims made in support of a governance motion. I am exercising that right now. Victor's smile dimmed by several degrees. His lead attorney whispered something in his ear. He waved it off. Fine, let's hear your audit. Rowan turned to the door. Please ask Mr. Cole to come in. Darius entered the boardroom the way he entered every room, quietly, without posture or performance. His presence registering not as charisma, but as weight, the gravitational pull of someone who is exactly where he intends to be. He wore a dark blue suit that Rowan had insisted on, and that he wore with the slight discomfort of a man more accustomed to canvas and cotton, but it fit him well, and the effect was striking. The ruggedness of his face and the breadth of his shoulders were not diminished by tailoring merely reframed. He carried a single flash drive. Victor saw him, and for the first time the smile vanished entirely. In its place was something raw and immediate, a flash of recognition followed by a rapid visible calculation, the expression of a man whose mental fortress has just discovered an open gate. "Who is this?" said Harla Mercer, the board's senior independent director. Darius Cole Rowan said, special compliance auditor retained by Hayes Meridian to conduct a technical review of the intellectual property underpinning Mr. Crane's board credentials, specifically the Apex Biodome. Victor's lead attorney stood. "Objection. This individual is unknown to us, and his presence was not disclosed in advance. The charter doesn't require advance disclosure of compliance witnesses," Lauren said without looking up from her briefs. Section 14, subsection C. Shall I read it aloud? The attorney sat down. Darius connected the flash drive to the conference room's presentation system, and the main screen filled with code. Thousands of lines of parametric equations rendered in a clean, mono-spaced type of a development environment. The board members stared at it with the blank incomprehension of people confronted with a language they didn't speak. But Victor stared at it with something else entirely. "What you're looking at," Darius said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet room, "is the core physics algorithm of the Apex Biodome structural framework. This algorithm governs how the lattice distributes load across the diatom shell geometry. It is the heart of the design, the single most complex and original element of the project, and it is what earned the Aldrich Prize." He advanced to the next slide. This is the same algorithm as it appears in the Aldrich Prize submission filed under the name of Crane Stanton Partners on November 14th, 5 years ago. Note the timestamp and the attribution. Next slide. And this is the same algorithm as it exists in my original development files created on my proprietary BIM platform Lattice Core, which was never licensed to or installed on any Crane Stanton system. He paused. The creation date is August 22nd, 6 years ago, 14 months before the Aldrich submission. A murmur moved around the table like a current. "Timestamps can be manipulated," Victor said, his voice sharp now, the smoothness stripped away. "They can," Darius agreed, "which is why I'm not relying on timestamps alone." He advanced to the next slide, and the screen filled with a single line of code highlighted in yellow. This is a parametric offset value embedded in the angular distribution function of the primary load-bearing struts. The value is 071483. To a casual observer or to someone who acquired this code without understanding it, this appears to be an arbitrary coefficient. It is not. He turned to face the board. "This number is my late wife's birthday, July 14th, 1983. I embedded it in the algorithm as a personal signature, a digital watermark that affects the structural output by 0.003 degrees, a variation invisible in renderings but critical to the simulation's accuracy. I can demonstrate on this system right now that removing or modifying this value causes the load-bearing simulation to show catastrophic failure. Mr. Crane's team never identified this variable as meaningful because they never understood the code deeply enough to recognize it. It has remained in every version of the Biodome design, including the one filed for the Aldrich Prize, unchanged and unexamined. It is my signature, and it proves authorship." The room was silent. Rowan watched the board members' faces and saw the shift, the slow tectonic realignment of loyalty and calculation that happened when powerful people realized they had been lied to by one of their own. Victor stood. "This is absurd. This man is a disgruntled former contractor attempting to, I am the architect of the Apex Biodome," Darius said, and the absolute unshakable calm of his voice made Victor's bluster sound like what it was. Noise. 5 years ago, Mr. Crane's firm acquired my company's intellectual property through a transaction that exploited my family's medical crisis. I signed under duress. The IP transfer attributed my work to Crane Stanton, and an NDA prohibited me from asserting my authorship publicly. But I was hired by Hayes Meridian as a technical auditor, not as a public claimant, and the evidence I am presenting is drawn from the public domain filing of the Aldrich Prize, which anyone can audit. The metadata speaks for itself. Lauren stood. For the board's information, our legal team has prepared a comprehensive filing with the Federal Bureau of Commercial Integrity documenting what we believe to be systematic intellectual property fraud by Victor Crane, including the predatory acquisition of Lattice Structural, the fraudulent attribution of the biodome design, and the use of those fabricated credentials to secure a seat on this board. Additionally, we have evidence linking Mr. Crane personally to Pinnacle Ventures, the entity behind the current proxy accumulation, through a series of wire transfers routed through Calder Island's holding companies. This evidence has been forwarded to the relevant regulatory authorities as of this morning. Victor's face had gone the color of old wax. His attorneys were whispering furiously, but he wasn't listening. He was staring at Darius with an expression that Rowan recognized because she had seen it on the faces of men who had underestimated her for her entire career. The sick dawning comprehension that the person you dismissed as irrelevant was the one who destroyed you. I moved to table. The restructuring motion, Harla Mercer said, his voice heavy with the particular gravity of a man who has just realized he was nearly complicit in a fraud, and to suspend Mr. Crane's board privileges pending the outcome of the regulatory investigation. The vote was unanimous. Victor left the building flanked by his attorneys, and the glass doors of the Hayes Meridian Tower closed behind him with a sound that Rowan felt in her chest like a lock turning. She stood at the window of the 42nd floor and watched his car pull away, and she waited for triumph to arrive, for the rush of victory she'd imagined during all those sleepless nights in the Crescent Bay villa. But what came instead was quieter than that. A long, slow exhale, as though she'd been holding her breath for months and had only just remembered how to release it. Darius was in the hallway, leaning against the wall with his suit jacket already off and his sleeves already rolled 3 precise folds, as though his body was renegotiating its terms with the fabric now that the performance was over. Lily's latest drawing was visible in the inner pocket of the jacket, a corner of purple crayon peeking out the bears of mosswood accompanying him into battle. "Thank you," Rowan said. He shook his head. "You don't owe me thanks. You gave me a chance to say her name in a room full of people to make them hear it. Simone. You gave me that." Something expanded in her chest that she could not name. She nodded because speaking would have cost her the composure she'd maintained all morning. And they stood in the hallway of her company's tower with the city sprawling below them and the afternoon light streaming through the glass, and neither of them moved to close the distance. And neither of them needed to, because what was between them was not the kind of thing that required rushing. The weeks that followed rearranged everything. The Federal Bureau of Commercial Integrity opened a formal investigation into Victor Crane's intellectual property practices, and the preliminary findings were damning enough to ensure that the case would take years to resolve and that Victor's professional reputation, already in freefall, would not survive the landing. The divorce settlement, stripped of Victor's fraudulent claims, was finalized quickly and cleanly, and Rowan emerged from it lighter than she'd felt in years, as though the legal dissolution of her marriage had also dissolved the weight she'd been carrying in her bones. Hayes Meridian stabilized. The board chastened by how close they'd come to installing a fraud, as their leader rallied behind Rowan with a loyalty that bordered on fervent, and the company's stock price, which had sagged under the uncertainty of the proxy fight, recovered and then surged. Rowan threw herself into the work, but differently now, not with the desperate, sleepless intensity of a woman fighting for survival, but with the focused, sustainable energy of someone who had remembered why she built the company in the first place. Darius declined every offer that came his way. The Aldrich Committee, once the truth became public, reached out to discuss retroactively attributing the biodome to its actual creator. 3 major firms contacted him about partnerships. A university offered him a named professorship. He said no to all of it. He used the substantial settlement from the fraud case to purchase a large plot of coastal land just south of Crescent Bay, a stretch of wind-swept bluff with a natural cove and a stand of old-growth Sitka. And he built a new workshop there, a beautiful open structure of reclaimed timber and hand-fitted stone with a view of the ocean from every window. He called it Lattice Woodworks, keeping the name like a scar he decided to wear openly. And he filled it with hand tools and salvaged wood and the particular kind of quiet that only exists in places where difficult things have been made whole. Rowan heard about the new workshop from her property manager, who mentioned it offhandedly during a call about the villa's maintenance schedule. She'd been back in Harlan City for 3 weeks by then, and she told herself the tightness in her chest when she heard his name was residual stress or caffeine or the particular melancholy of autumn. She told herself this for exactly 4 days, and then she stopped telling herself anything and started packing. She drove down on a Saturday, leaving the city before dawn, trading the glass and steel skyline for the winding coastal highway that hugged Carver Shore like a lover reluctant to let go. She wore jeans and a white linen shirt and flat leather sandals, and her designer heels, the ones she wore like armor in the boardroom, sat in the back seat of her car like artifacts from a former life. The radio played something low and acoustic that she didn't recognize, and the windows were down, and the salt air came in and filled the car, and she breathed it deep and felt something in her chest open like a fist unclenching. She found the workshop by the sound of it, the rhythmic whisper of a hand plane, the same sound she'd heard on the first day in Crescent Bay, carrying on the wind like a pulse. The building was set back from the bluff's edge, surrounded by spruce and wild coastal grass, and the late afternoon sun was painting its western wall in shades of amber and rose. The double doors were open, and golden light spilled out onto the gravel path like an invitation. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The interior was warm and cavernous, smelling of cedar and beeswax, and the faint ozone tang of the nearby sea. Workbenches lined the walls, each one holding a project in some stage of completion, and the tools were arranged with a precision that was almost architectural, every chisel and gouge and rasp in its designated place. In the center of the room, on a massive trestle table, sat a piece of sunken driftwood, the size of a small boat, dark and gnarled and beautiful. The kind of wood that had spent decades in the ocean before, washing ashore, salted and sculpted by currents into something that was neither raw nor finished, but somewhere in between. Darius was at one end of the table, shaping the wood's surface with a curved draw knife, his body angled into the work with the same focused, unhurried authority she remembered. He'd let his hair grow slightly longer, and the silver at his temples was more pronounced, and his forearms, bare below rolled sleeves, were dusted with fine wood shavings that caught the light like flecks of gold. He looked up when her shadow crossed the threshold, and the expression that moved across his face was not surprise, because Darius Cole was not a man who was easily surprised, but something warmer and more complex, a recognition that had been waiting for its moment. "Rowan," he said. "Darius." Lily appeared from behind the driftwood like a woodland creature emerging from a hollow log. Her amber eyes bright, her hair in 2 uneven braids that suggested her father's enthusiastic but imperfect efforts, and her hands covered in the pale dust of sanding. Barnaby the sea otter was propped on the workbench nearby, supervising. "Rowan," she said with the uncomplicated delight of a child who has decided you belong in her world. "Come look. We're fixing the rot." Rowan crossed the room. Up close, the driftwood was extraordinary, its surface a landscape of ridges and hollows, some sections dark and compromised, where salt and time had eaten away the fibers, other sections gleaming with the dense honeycomb heartwood that had survived. Lily was sanding one of the heartwood sections with a small block, her strokes careful and purposeful, and the wood beneath her fingers was emerging smooth and luminous, the grain revealed in swirling patterns that looked like weather systems seen from space. "It washed up in the last storm," Darius said, setting down the draw knife. "Lily found it. She insisted we bring it home." "It was sad," Lily explained with the matter-of-fact authority of someone stating an obvious truth. "It was stuck on the rocks and the waves kept hitting it, and it looked like it needed to be somewhere warm." "It's beautiful," Rowan said, and meant the wood and the girl and the room and the light and the sound of the ocean through the open doors. And the way Darius was looking at her with those steady, warm amber eyes that had never once taken from her anything she didn't freely give. Darius reached behind him and picked up a piece of sandpaper from the workbench. "Fine grit. She noticed the kind you use at the end when the rough work is done and all that's left is revealing." what was always underneath. He held it out to her. "Want to help?" She took it. Their fingers touched briefly, and the contact was warm and dry and more deliberate than it appeared. A gesture that was not an accident, and that neither of them pretended was one. "What do I do?" she asked, though she already had known since the first morning on the platform when he'd handed her a wind-caught page and explained the physics of moving air with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge was a form of care. "Sand away the rot," he said, his voice quiet, his eyes on hers. "And what's left will never collapse." She pressed the sandpaper against the wood and began to work her strokes, falling into rhythm beside Lily's. And Darius picked up his draw knife and returned to his end of the table, and the three of them worked together in the golden light, while the sun lowered itself toward the ocean and the shadows lengthened across the workshop floor. The driftwood emerged slowly under their hands, its hidden beauty revealed grain by grain, and Rowan felt the last of something heavy and old release from behind her sternum and dissolve into the salt air carried out through the open doors to a sea that had always known how to take broken things and smooth them into something new. No one spoke. The handplane whispered. The sandpaper hummed. Lily began to hum along a tuneless, contented melody that rose and fell like the surf. And Rowan closed her eyes for a moment and let the sound and the warmth and the smell of cedar fill her completely. And in the soft red darkness behind her eyelids, she saw the shape of a future that was not a boardroom or a battle or a contract, but something simpler and stronger built without hardware joined at the grain designed to hold. When she opened her eyes, Darius was watching her. Not the way men had always watched her, calculating her value or cataloging her beauty or measuring what they could take. He watched her the way he watched wood, with patience and respect, and the quiet certainty that whatever was underneath would be worth the effort of uncovering. She held his gaze. The sun touched the ocean. The workshop filled with the kind of light that only exists in the last minutes before evening, when the world goes soft and warm, and every surface becomes precious. And in that light, standing at opposite ends of a piece of reclaimed driftwood with a 6-year-old girl and a stuffed sea otter between them, Rowan Hayes and Darius Cole made no grand declaration and exchanged no dramatic kiss. What they exchanged was subtler and more durable than that. A look that was a promise, a silence that was an agreement, a shared understanding that the strongest structures are not the ones that resist every storm, but the ones that know how to bend and hold and grow around the damage, incorporating it into their design until it becomes not a weakness, but a source of unexpected, unbreakable strength. Lily looked up from her sanding, glanced between the two adults, and smiled with the knowing satisfaction of someone whose kingdom of bears had taught her everything she needed to understand about alliances. "Barnaby says you should stay for dinner," she announced. "Tell Barnaby I'd love to," Rowan said, and so she stayed. Not just for dinner, but for the evening and the conversation that followed, and the quiet walk along the bluff in the blue dusk, while Lily rode on Darius's shoulders and pointed out constellations she'd invented because the real ones weren't interesting enough. And when Rowan finally drove home that night with salt on her skin and sawdust on her fingers and a warmth in her chest that felt like the first day of something she'd been too afraid to name, she knew she would come back. Not because she needed to be rescued or fixed or completed, but because she had found in a workshop on a windswept bluff the rarest thing in the world, a place where she could put down her armor and be the full, complicated, unfinished version of herself, and be met there with steady hands and quiet eyes and the patience of a man who understood that the best things are built slowly and built to last, too. The ocean murmured against the shore. The stars came out one by one over Crescent Bay, and somewhere in a workshop filled with golden light and the smell of cedar, a piece of driftwood sat on a trestle table, half sanded and half wild, waiting for tomorrow when they would all come back and continue the work of revealing what had always been underneath. If this story moved you, or if you felt something stir in the silence between Rowan and Darius that you'd like to feel again, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and stay with us, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories about strong people finding their way back to something real. I'll see you in the next one.